"Ma'am, we need you to empty your pockets," the bank manager demanded, his voice rising above the ambient buzz of the Midtown Manhattan branch. Conversations paused, heads turned, and suddenly, all eyes were on her. 78-year-old Mildred Davis, standing at the teller's counter in a floral headscarf and gently scuffed orthopedic shoes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped her worn handbag, trying to make sense of the accusation. Mildred had only come in to cash a modest Social Security check, the same as she had every month for years. But today, something was different. Maybe it was her coat, too large and faded. Or maybe it was simply the color of her skin. Whatever it was, the suspicion hung in the air like smog. She looked around the room for a shred of kindness, but no one moved. A security guard hovered nearby, one hand resting just above his holster. The manager crossed his arms, waiting. Mildred slowly reached into her coat pocket, her dignity unraveling one thread at a time. What the bank manager didn't know, and what no one in the lobby could have guessed, was that Mildred Davis was not just some forgotten old woman living out her days in Harlem. She was the mother of Julian Davis, one of the most powerful and reclusive tech billionaires. Founder of Vireon Systems, Julian had built an empire in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. But long before he became a mogul with a penthouse in Tribeca and stock in every major tech firm, he had been a boy raised in a small apartment by the same woman, now being humiliated in front of strangers. Julian and his mother hadn't spoken in nearly 15 years. The reasons were layered, complicated by hurt, pride, and old wounds. Yet even estranged, a bond like theirs doesn't disappear. And when word of the incident reached Julian, it didn't just sting, it ignited something deep inside him. The kind of quiet fury only a son can feel when the world forgets who raised him. The video started as a grainy clip posted by a college student waiting in line behind Mildred. It showed the manager's accusation, the tightening of the security guard's stance, and Mildred's confused, heartbreaking compliance. Within hours, the clip had been shared thousands of times, first across Twitter, then picked up by TikTok influencers and journalists. Julian was in a board meeting in San Francisco when his assistant whispered something in his ear and slid a phone across the table. He stared at the screen, unblinking, as the video looped. His boardroom of tech elites faded into silence as Julian stood up, excused himself, and walked out of the room. He made 3 calls before stepping into his private jet. The last call was to the bank's corporate headquarters. By morning, he said calmly into the phone, "I want a press release and a new manager, or I'll buy the entire bank and dismantle it from the inside. Hey dear, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop in the comment. If this video is bringing you value, or even just a smile tapping the like button and subscribing means the world. It might be a small gesture that helps us reach more hearts like yours. All right, let's see what happened next." As Julian's jet cut through the sky toward New York, he leaned back in the leather seat. But rest didn't come easy. His mind wandered, not to algorithms or IPOs, but to a tiny kitchen on 145th Street, where a young Julian once watched his mother fix a broken stove with duct tape and prayer. He had promised her then, through a mouthful of cereal, that one day she'd never have to struggle again. And then life happened, success, ambition, resentment. He built his empire without her, convinced she wouldn't understand the world he now lived in. They hadn't spoken since the argument over his father's funeral, a bitter night neither had been willing to revisit. Yet beneath the ice, the love never died. Seeing her on that screen, small, defenseless, proud, he realized he had failed in the one place that mattered most, showing up for her. Mildred sat quietly in her apartment that night, watching the news with a stoic face. Her story was everywhere, on every screen, in every feed. She wasn't sure how to feel. Embarrassed? Angry? She'd lived long enough to see uglier days, but this one cut differently. Then came a knock on the door. When she opened it, her breath caught. Julian, taller than she remembered, his eyes older, wearier. He stood there with no cameras, no entourage, just her son, holding a bouquet of her favorite calla lilies and a face full of regret. She didn't speak at first. Neither did he. Then she stepped aside and opened the door wide. Julian didn't wait for morning. He called the CEO of Landmark Trust Bank the moment he landed. The call didn't begin with small talk. "You're going to issue a public apology," he said. "You're going to fire the manager. You're going to implement mandatory anti-bias training across your branches. And if you don't, I will buy your bank, gut your board, and turn your brand into a cautionary tale." The CEO stammered, trying to backpedal to explain. But Julian didn't care. This wasn't just about policy. It was about his mother. It was about the thousands like her. His voice was ice. "You profile the queen," he said, "and I'm going to make sure the world knows it." By morning, Landmark Trust stock had plummeted by 8%. News broke that Julian Davis was in talks to acquire a controlling stake. Their PR team scrambled to draft a statement, but Julian beat them to it. He posted on his personal social media account, a rare move, with a single devastating message. "My mother was profiled. This is what racism looks like in 2025. I'm not just calling it out, I'm calling it to account." The post went viral instantly. Celebrities, activists, politicians, all joined in. Protesters stood outside the bank's flagship branches. Executives resigned. The fallout had just begun. Landmark Trust Bank issued an apology on live television. The manager had been terminated, they said. They pledged to invest millions into diversity training and community partnerships. But when reporters reached Mildred for a statement, she said nothing. She didn't need a media circus. She needed her dignity restored, not exploited. She sat beside Julian during the press conference, holding his hand but letting him speak. Her silence was louder than words, a quiet testimony of strength, pride, and generational resilience. One camera caught her wiping a tear, but she quickly regained her poise. This wasn't the closure she expected, but it was justice, in a form few ever received. Back in Harlem, people recognized her everywhere. Grocery clerks called her Miss Davis with newfound respect. Children whispered her name with awe. Local news called her the grandmother who changed banking. But for Mildred, the biggest change wasn't on the streets. It was in her home. Julian had returned, not just an apology, but with intention. He visited every day, fixed up her apartment, even cooked her breakfast one Saturday morning, just like he used to. Their laughter, once extinct, began to echo again. They didn't speak much about the past. They didn't need to. They were writing a new chapter together. Julian wasn't done. "What happened to you," he told his mother, "happens to others every day. I have money. I have power. And I'm going to use it." He created the Mildred Davis Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting systemic racism in banking and finance. He also announced a new initiative, free financial literacy programs in underprivileged communities, named Mildred's Way. Scholarships followed. A national campaign. Bank executives began to change policies under public pressure. It was a Tuesday morning when Julian received the email. A memo leaked from Landmark Trust's top legal advisor, mocking the elderly distraction and noting how even black billionaires have emotional weaknesses. Julian didn't get angry. He got calculating. That afternoon, he walked into the corporate headquarters of Landmark Trust in a tailored black suit, sunglasses hiding eyes that had seen too much injustice to blink now. Without fanfare, he stepped into the lobby, pulled out his phone, and made the call. "Activate Project Sentinel," he said to his legal team on speaker. "They've underestimated my silence for too long." Within minutes, the firm's top shareholders began getting calls. Major clients froze their accounts. Partners from London, Tokyo, and Johannesburg demanded emergency meetings. The stock price dipped before lunch. Julian didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He moved with precision, like someone who knew exactly where power lives and how to take it back when it's abused. Upstairs, the executive scrambled. Downstairs, the same lobby where Mildred had been humiliated became the stage of a quiet reckoning. Julian stood exactly where she had stood weeks ago, not to retaliate, but to remember. Justice wasn't a headline for him. It was personal. Now we ask you, what would you have done in Julian's shoes? What does justice look like when silence is no longer an option? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. That evening, after the dust had barely begun to settle, Julian returned to his penthouse overlooking the city skyline. He didn't speak to his assistants or check his emails. Instead, he went straight to the old mahogany box tucked beneath the leather-bound books in his study. Inside it were a few faded photographs, a pressed flower from his mother's garden, and a yellowed envelope addressed in soft, trembling handwriting, Julian. He had found the letter years ago, but never opened it. Written by his mother during the 10-year silence between them, it had been her last attempt to reach out. Tonight, something in him shifted. He broke the seal. "My dearest Julian," it began, "I don't need your money. I need your heart. I miss the boy who used to race home just to tell me he aced his math test. I know you're out there changing the world, but sometimes I wonder if the world changed you more." Tears blurred the words. Julian, the tech mogul feared by boardrooms and admired by investors, sat in silence as his mother's voice came through ink and paper. Every sentence was a bridge he had burned with time and ego. And now it hurt, not just because of the injustice done to her, but because he had let years pass without fixing what truly mattered. In that moment, Julian wasn't a billionaire. He was a son, grieving the space between forgiveness and pride. Have you ever held onto something too long, until it became a burden instead of a memory? Share your story or reflection in the comments. Let's talk about second chances and the courage to take them. Julian sat at the window long after the letter had been read. The city glowed beneath him, full of people who knew his name but not his pain. He held the letter in his hand like it was a fragile thing, too sacred to fold back into its envelope. For the first time in years, he wanted to hear her voice, not as a billionaire seeking strategy, but as a son needing comfort. He picked up the phone and hovered his thumb over her number. It was still saved in his contacts under Mom. He had passed that number 1,000 times over the years and never once called. Something always stopped him: resentment, guilt, stubborn pride. Tonight, his fingers trembled. He pressed the call button. 3 rings, then 4. Voicemail. Her voice, still there. Soft, patient, unaware of the storm he carried. "Hi, this is Mildred Davis. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." He didn't speak. He listened until the beep, then remained silent until the call cut off. Maybe it wasn't the right time, or maybe he was still gathering the courage to say what she deserved to hear. But a voicemail wasn't enough. She needed to see him, to know he heard her, finally. He stared at the city lights one more time before whispering to the night, "I'm coming home." The train ride to his mother's neighborhood was long, not because of distance, but because of the weight Julian carried. He had taken private jets to conferences, helicopters to elite islands, and driverless cars through Silicon Valley. But tonight, he chose the subway, the way he used to as a boy, legs swinging from the hard plastic seats, staring out the window at tunnels covered in graffiti that looked like murals of forgotten voices. When he reached the old neighborhood, something inside him cracked. The streets were narrower than he remembered. The corner stores still had the same flickering neon sign. And her building, brown brick with peeling paint, stood like a stubborn relic of a life he had tried to leave behind, but could never outrun. He climbed the stairs slowly, each creak echoing his hesitation. His heart pounded louder with every step. What if she slammed the door? What if she couldn't forgive him? What if she had already replaced hope with acceptance that her son would never come back? He stood outside her apartment for what felt like hours, staring at the faded numbers on the door. 3B. A door he hadn't knocked on in over a decade. He raised his fist and knocked. From inside, there was a shuffle, then silence. Then her voice. "Who is it?" He cleared his throat. It caught. He tried again. "It's me, Ma." The lock clicked. Slowly, the door opened. She stood there, older, thinner, but still carrying that quiet strength. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted, but no words came. He looked at her, broken and small in the hallway light, and whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't speak. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Years dissolved in that embrace. Mildred's embrace was neither tight nor rushed. It was soft, careful, as if she were touching a memory to make sure it was real. Julian held her like he used to as a boy, before the money, before the pride, before the distance. When she finally stepped back, her hands lingered on his face. "You've changed," she whispered, eyes scanning him with both awe and aching. "But you're still my boy." Julian nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I should have come sooner." She didn't scold him, didn't guilt him. She simply turned and walked inside, leaving the door open behind her. The apartment smelled the same: lavender oil, old wood, and a hint of cornbread. Everything was as he remembered. The crocheted doilies, the family photos with slightly crooked frames, the sofa with the sunken cushion where he used to sit and do homework. His eyes caught one picture in particular, a younger him, arms crossed, standing beside her at his high school graduation. She had been so proud that day. He hadn't realized then that pride could age into loneliness. They sat on the couch, the silence now a blanket, warm and safe. "You kept my number all this time?" he asked quietly. She smiled gently. "I deleted a lot of things over the years. That wasn't one of them." Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I read your letter." Her eyes watered. "I wondered if you ever would." They didn't need to say much. Some healing begins in stillness, when presence replaces apology. The days that followed were slow, healing, and quietly powerful. They cooked together like they once did, Mildred chopping onions while Julian struggled with the cornbread mix, just like when he was 12. They watched old shows, laughed at commercials, and occasionally drifted into conversations that had waited a decade to happen. But one evening, as a late spring rain tapped against the windows and the lamp cast a soft golden hue across the room, Mildred finally brought it up, the incident. She sat in her usual armchair, the one with a small tear in the fabric she never bothered to fix. Julian was on the couch, legs stretched, scrolling through something on his phone before setting it aside. "Julian, why did you really do all that? The bank, the stock shakeup, the lawyers, the press." Julian looked at her, not dodging the weight of her question. "Because what they did to you, they've done to so many others who don't have someone like me. I couldn't let that stand." Mildred watched him, stunned. "You're doing all this for me?" He shook his head, smiling gently. "For us." Her eyes softened, misted with unspoken gratitude. In that moment, she saw the son she had raised, a boy with a spine of iron and a heart she thought the world had stolen. But it hadn't. Not entirely. That night, the rain continued to fall, and in the glow of their reunion, something more powerful than revenge was born: shared dignity. What would you have done for someone you love if the world humiliated them? Would you rise, fight, forgive, or all the above? Drop your reflections below. We want to hear your heart. They sat in the soft quiet of the living room, where time had barely touched the furniture but had rewritten everything between them. Mildred reached for her tea, fingers trembling slightly, though whether from age or emotion, Julian couldn't tell. Across from her, he leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring not at her but at the space between them, like he was trying to make peace with a version of himself that had once lived here and then disappeared. "I don't even remember why I stopped calling," he said quietly, not asking for sympathy, just naming the ghost in the room. Mildred didn't answer right away. She sipped her tea, then looked at him. "You were trying to become someone they couldn't ignore." Julian's head dropped for a moment. "Yeah, and I thought forgetting where I came from would make it easier to stay where I was going." She nodded slowly, eyes never leaving him. "But the world will always try to make you forget who you are. I just prayed you'd remember before it was too late." The air between them wasn't heavy, it was sacred. The kind of quiet that only exists between two people who have lost time but haven't lost hope. Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Not the letter, a photograph. It was the same graduation picture from the mantel, but this one had his handwritten words on the back. "You gave me the wings. I just forgot who taught me to fly." He handed it to her. Mildred pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. "I never needed you to be perfect, Julian. Just present." He moved beside her and held her hand. No fanfare, no grand speeches. Just the sun finally arriving, not to fix everything, but to be part of it again. Sometimes, love doesn't come with confessions. It comes with staying in the room, holding a hand, and choosing not to run anymore. The days that followed were slow, healing, and quietly powerful. They cooked together like they once did, Mildred chopping onions while Julian struggled with the cornbread mix, just like when he was 12. They watched old shows, laughed at commercials, and occasionally drifted into conversations that had waited a decade to happen. But one evening, as a late spring rain tapped against the windows and the lamp cast a soft golden hue across the room, Mildred finally brought it up, the incident. She sat in her usual armchair, the one with a small tear in the fabric she never bothered to fix. Julian was on the couch, legs stretched, scrolling through something on his phone before setting it aside. "Julian, why did you really do all that? The bank, the stock shakeup, the lawyers, the press." Julian looked at her, not dodging the weight of her question. "Because what they did to you, they've done to so many others who don't have someone like me. I couldn't let that stand." Mildred watched him, stunned. "You're doing all this for me?" He shook his head, smiling gently. "For us." Her eyes softened, misted with unspoken gratitude. In that moment, she saw the son she had raised, a boy with a spine of iron and a heart she thought the world had stolen. But hadn't. Not entirely. That night, the rain continued to fall, and in the glow of their reunion, something more powerful than revenge was born: shared dignity. Gavin Brooks had been the branch manager at Landmark Trust for 17 years. He wore expensive suits, spoke in crisp sound bites, and treated every customer interaction like a negotiation. To his colleagues, he was a man of efficiency. To the regulars, especially the elderly, he was a cold gatekeeper. And to Mildred Davis, he had been the face of humiliation. When news broke that Landmark Trust was under fire, stock price plunging, executive heads rolling, shareholder panic, Gavin assumed it had nothing to do with him. After all, he had only followed procedure. He hadn't shouted at Mildred. He hadn't cursed. He just dismissed her, like she didn't matter. But one morning, he arrived to find his office locked. His nameplate was gone. Inside the branch, the regional director stood waiting, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Gavin," she said, "corporates decided to terminate your contract. Effective immediately." He blinked. "Terminate? What for? I've never had a single write-up. I've hit every performance metric." She handed him a file, one he recognized from HR, for fostering a culture of exclusion, for negligence in dignity, and for failing to act when a loyal customer was publicly shamed. Security walked him out, not with cruelty, but with finality. Outside, the city buzzed uncaring. Gavin stood on the sidewalk, briefcase in hand, heart pounding in his ears. A cameraman across the street pointed a lens in his direction. The headline would come later: "Landmark manager ousted amid cultural reckoning." That night, he sat in his modest condo, watching a video someone had posted online. It showed Mildred, smiling, graceful, thanking supporters, and speaking at a local town hall. In the background stood Julian, silent and steady. Gavin had never imagined her as anything more than another customer. But now, watching her speak, he realized the cost of his indifference. No public apology would undo it. No PR campaign could rewrite his moment of quiet cruelty. He had lost his job, but more than that, he had lost the illusion that neutrality was harmless, that politeness was the same as kindness. He learned the lesson the hard way. Silence, too, can wound. And sometimes the greatest fall doesn't come from scandal, but from being forgotten by the future. Have you ever dismissed someone without meaning to, only to realize later how much it cost them? And you? What did you learn from it? We invite you to share. Every voice matters, especially the quiet ones. The next morning, Julian stepped out into Mildred's small backyard with a mug of coffee she had brewed just the way he used to like it, dark with a hint of cinnamon. The sun was still stretching awake, casting long golden beams through the creaking fence and the tall grass he'd once begged her to let him skip mowing. He took a seat on the porch steps. No assistants, no alerts buzzing in his pocket. Just bird song, the faint rustle of leaves, and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. It was a silence no boardroom could offer, a peace no penthouse could buy. Inside, Mildred was humming. Something about that sound made his throat tighten. It was the same hum she used to sing when she was folding laundry after a long shift, or waiting for dinner to cook, or calming her nerves when bills piled high. It wasn't cheerful. It was steady, It was home. Julian closed his eyes and let the weight of it all settle. The deals, the lawsuits, the applause, the betrayals. Somewhere along the climb, he'd confused power with healing. But now, sitting in the same backyard where he once learned how to ride a bike and got his first scraped knee, he understood. Money can change systems, but only love could mend what had cracked between them. Later, Mildred joined him. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside him, their shoulders barely touching. He passed her the second mug he'd prepared without asking. She took it, smiled. "I never stopped praying for you," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "I think that's what brought me back." They sat there until the sun had fully risen. No plans, no timelines, just two people who had finally arrived, not at a destination, but at each other. The event had unfolded swiftly. News of the termination of the bank manager had spread like wildfire across every news outlet. National TV had aired the broadcast, painting the narrative of the ruthless business decisions, the underhanded maneuvers, and the unavoidable downfall of the man who thought his power could outlast his arrogance. Yet, none of it fazed Julian. The moment he had heard that the bank had fired the manager, the same manager who had been behind the unjust treatment of Mildred, his mind was already working, calculating. He wasn't simply going to let this slide. He wasn't going to let them walk away from the harm they had caused with impunity. He was going to get the bank. He had already made the necessary calls, spoken to his legal team, and even engaged financial advisors. Julian had a singular, unwavering goal. He was going to buy the bank, not out of revenge, not even to exact some twisted form of retribution, but to use it as a means to set things right, to make sure Mildred and others like her could never again be subjected to such exploitation. It wasn't just business, it was personal. It was his mother's dignity that was at stake, and nothing else mattered. A few days later, Julian stood in the sterile, cold conference room with a clear sense of purpose. The faces around the table were tense, already anticipating his offer. "We will not be selling the bank," the CEO stated flatly, his voice cold and authoritative. Julian leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp, never leaving the CEO's face. He wasn't surprised by the response. In fact, he had expected it, but the resolve in his chest only grew. "I'm not asking," Julian replied calmly, his voice steady and unwavering. "I'm offering. A generous offer. And you'll find I have no shortage of funds to back it up." The CEO met his gaze, trying to remain composed, but Julian could see the faint hint of discomfort in the man's eyes. "You're wasting your time. After the national broadcast, we've already made our stance clear. We've severed ties with the bank manager. We are not selling, no matter what you offer." Julian's jaw tightened, but his demeanor remained controlled. He knew this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about restoring what was rightfully his, what should have always been his mother's. The treatment she had received, the humiliation, the lies they would pay for that. "I know you've made your statement, but you should also know I don't stop when I'm told no, especially when I'm determined to protect what matters. You'll either sell this bank, or I will buy every stake, every share, until it's no longer a choice." His voice dropped, and for a moment, there was a weight in the room that felt as though the very air had thickened. The CEO's eyes flashed with the slightest bit of concern, though he quickly masked it with his usual corporate stoicism. "That's a threat." "It's a promise," Julian countered, his gaze unwavering. There was a long pause. The room seemed to hold its breath as Julian's words hung heavily in the air. The executives exchanged glances, unsure of how to handle the situation. Julian had them on edge, and the tension was palpable. But the bank was adamant. The offer was rejected. Julian stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. Then we're at an impasse. He took a step towards the door, pausing just before exiting. "But mark my words, this isn't over. I'll make sure this bank has a future, and I'll make sure your past won't follow you. You may have the upper hand for now, but the game's not finished. Not yet." He left the room without another word, his departure as calculated and precise as everything he had done up until that moment. The executives sat frozen, the weight of his words slowly sinking in. As Julian left the building, he felt an odd sense of calm. This was no longer about simply buying a bank. This was about something deeper, something more visceral, his mother's freedom. It wasn't just money he sought. It was control, redemption, and justice. It was the thing he couldn't offer her when she had needed him the most. Now, he would make sure that those who thought they were untouchable would feel the consequences of their actions. He could almost hear her voice in his mind, proud yet soft, reminding him of the quiet strength he'd once forgotten. And he was going to make that strength a reality for both of them. What would you do if you had the power to right a wrong, but faced opposition at every turn? How far would you go to protect someone you love? Do you think this an oppression or misused of power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Julian had been told no, firmly, publicly, with the kind of confidence that only comes from men who believe their world is untouchable. But they didn't know Julian Davis. They didn't know that once he set his sights on something, especially something for his mother, he would burn every bridge, shake every tree, and drain every account to make it happen. The rejection didn't slow him down. It fueled him. He didn't go back to his office. He didn't rant online. He went to work. Within 48 hours, Julian quietly began acquiring shares of the bank. Not in one swoop, not in his name. He used shell companies, investment arms, private equity firms he already had influence over. Every share purchase was quiet, strategic, a ripple in a calm, scene no one noticed, until the tide began to rise. Behind the scenes, he pulled in advisors who specialized in hostile takeovers. He didn't want drama, but he wasn't afraid of war. Every loophole, every soft shareholder, every old grudge held by board members, Julian unearthed them all. And piece by piece, he built his empire inside theirs. In just under 11 weeks, he owned 41% of the bank. That was when the phone call started. The same CEO who had arrogantly said, "We are not selling," now requested a private meeting. Julian declined. Twice. When he finally agreed to meet, he did so at a modest cafe in D.C., the kind of place his mother loved. The irony wasn't lost on him. "We underestimated your persistence," the CEO said, avoiding Julian's eyes. "No," Julian said calmly. "You underestimated how far a son would go for his mother. There were no negotiations." Julian didn't haggle or ask for terms. He presented the final paperwork and stated simply, "Sign or be replaced." And they signed. 3 months after Mildred was humiliated in that bank lobby, her son officially became the majority owner of the very institution that shamed her. The headlines exploded. From injustice to ownership, billionaire Julian Davis acquires bank after mother's public mistreatment. He didn't just buy the bank. He restructured it. The first policy change, zero tolerance for discrimination. The second, a scholarship fund in Mildred's name for Black students studying finance. The third, every branch had to undergo community outreach programs led by local voices, especially in underserved Black communities. The old CEO? Replaced. The manager who humiliated Mildred? Blacklisted from every major bank. And Mildred? She still wore the same shoes. Still hummed while making tea. But now, she sat on the board of the bank, her name engraved on the building where she was once accused like a criminal. She didn't want the power, but she accepted the respect. Julian didn't buy the bank to get even. He bought it to make sure no one like his mother would ever be treated like that again. He didn't just make a statement. He changed the system. Would you have done the same for your mother? Or someone you love? How far would you go to rewrite their story, and maybe history too? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about justice, dignity, and how love changes everything. If this video brings you value, or even just a smile, tapping the like button and subscribing means the world. It might be a small gesture that helps us reach more hearts like yours.